Over the past 3 episodes, we've discussed the greatest wealth transfer and its challenges in detail, and how pro-family behavior is a key focus area for SFO Research. Effectively, a paradigm shift is taking place, and frameworks and tools could certainly be helpful. Financial markets close at 5 p.m. Night markets open at 6. My name is Gerrit Schmidt. I'm Deputy CEO at Schmidt Family Office and Head of Family Governance Research at SFO Research. This evening I'm back in studio with my colleague and collaborator, Dr. Morne Mostert, who focuses on the cognitive sciences and specifically looking at mindset in his current research. Morne, welcome to Night Markets.
Great to be back at the table with you, Gerrit.
Morne, we had part 1 where we framed the need for family mindset, or to start the conversation around family mindset. We brought a macroeconomic perspective because for these conversations you need real data.
Yeah.
But really what happened was that there were emergent topics, there were some sub-themes that we really had to explore, and that lent itself to a second conversation. This evening is our 3rd episode on family mindset. And for me, it was very important that we close the loop by getting very practical. I must tell you, upon reflecting on our show notes from the previous episode, that something that was very clear for me was that we needed to talk a bit more about mindset index, not as some esoteric thing, but actually as the instrument that you designed it to be.
Yes.
Can we just touch again on the background and how the development of Mindset Index came into being?
Yes, I'm very happy to do that. I think the important thing to understand about the development of the Mindset Index, which is this world first instrument for the scientific assessment of mindset, is that it really wasn't born in theory. It was born in practice. I've been lucky enough to work all over the world, in Paris and London and Rome and Geneva and a lot of the Middle East and Azerbaijan sometimes. It gets really crazy. And what I realized in working with senior people in large organizations all around the world is that these debates would break out. And when I first started, I thought, well, these are just functions of the company culture or the national culture. But what I realized is whether it was in Kigali or Geneva or Paris, the same debates started to break out. And so this made me have a closer look at why these decision makers were behaving like this. And the only conclusive evidence I could reach is that they fundamentally had different ways to think, different mindsets, different paradigms. And that's where the recording of these constructs start with the decision-making process. And it started in that reality of the boardroom debate with senior decision makers whose decisions will have significant impacts. That was the birthplace of this instrument. And, of course, subsequent to that, there was a huge amount of research that informed it. But the birthplace was practical decision-making.
Morne, that's wonderful, because I think, sort of as you were speaking, I just wanted to ask you, in terms of utility, if you've ever thought about the expression, well, I can't read your mind. Well, you can say now I can.
Yes.
But on a slightly more serious note, what's really interesting about this is, and you and I spoke about, at the risk of oversimplification, reducing this down to a 3-part process. Many times we look at behavior that is upsetting, or we look at behavior that is not helpful, and we think that change happens at that level. But really what you've introduced here, and again at the risk of oversimplification, is if we look at how decision-making process works, I'm talking about the output being behavior, what you really are saying is that it starts with mindset. Your mindset influences your decision-making.
Yeah.
And what people see is your behavior.
That's right.
But unless you are able to interrogate your mindset, so just working our way back,
Yeah.
you'll not be able to change your decision-making. The behavior will remain non-helpful or destructive or positive.
That's really exactly right. You can think of it like nutritional health and trying to improve your nutrition by rubbing broccoli on your skin. It looks like it should be healthy, but actually if you rub broccoli on your skin, but you eat fatty, salty, sugary things all day long, the consequence will not be what the broccoli gives you. The consequence will be what goes in the first place. And for decision-making, what goes in the first place is your mindset. And so without really understanding what mindset is about, what those paradigms are that inform the decision-making, you're never going to change the behaviors for the longer term.
Absolutely. And Morne, just because you said the word paradigm, it just made me think, and it'll probably sound bold, but if we look at the greatest wealth transfer in history, just to go back to our data, with a projected upwards of $84 trillion that will transfer from baby boomers and wealth creators to next generation custodians, we cannot deny that there's a paradigm shift. But here's the reality. Paradigms will not shift themselves.
Yes.
Frameworks and compatible instruments like Mindset Index could surely be helpful.
In fact, it's a great observation. And in fact, it's often the case when the society experiences these enormous paradigm shifts that you need something to guide you through it. And you're absolutely right. Paradigms don't change themselves. What could change paradigms, to quote Kuhn, one of the sort of fathers of thinking about scientific revolutions, is that a paradigm really shifts when the traditional paradigm, the traditional pattern of thinking, can no longer explain the large number of anomalies to that traditional thinking.
Right.
So if we apply your observation there to this transition in wealth,
Yes.
from baby boomers who have been the single most successful generation in the 250,000-year history of humanity,
Correct.
In financial terms, to a new generation with a new context, a different context, a much more appreciation, for example, of the planet and the society, then we should notice that paradigm is about to shift. Now, something needs to help us with that shift, and it is in the spirit of that contribution that Mindset Index has been created.
Absolutely. And for me, the real value of Mindset Index is that it's with a view to application.
That's right.
It's practical. It's useful. And one of the touch points we had that I quite enjoyed, which I'm not surprised to learn is a shared passion of ours, is Stoic philosophy.
No.
And something that sort of came up for me just upon reflection is, at its essence in Stoicism, is this idea that it's not things that upset us, right? It's our judgment about things. And there's extraordinary agency in that.
Yeah.
Because what it allows you to see is that you actually have so much power. Because whatever happens, it's about how you choose to respond to the thing. By extension of that thinking, bringing it back to the world of family governance with this very complex use case that we framed, greatest wealth transfer in history, there tends to be a lot of family conflict and real phenomenon like alienation and so forth. If you look at the typical family system, and we should probably also recognize and talk about the family as a social system, to bring it back to your world of systems thinking. If we look at the challenges that families face from a continuity perspective, would it not be helpful if you could have a reading on your own and collective mindset, simply just to be able to work better together?
I would put it even more strongly and say it's not only useful, it's a matter of survival. 80 years ago, large families that influenced the world were composed of largely homogenized and homogeneous groups. People were drawn from local areas as generations moved from the first generation as let's say the founder to the transition into the second generation and third generation. Those generations were all drawn from a relatively narrow geographical area, a relatively defined social spectrum. Today, that has changed dramatically. Of course, globalization is not news to anybody. But the reality is that we've never at a hyper-localized level faced the kind of diversity that we do today.
Absolutely.
And that diversity appears in many, many forms, not least of which is our paradigms. And paradigms are essentially just patterns of thought.
Absolutely.
The diversity in those paradigms has meant that we need something to help us read and understand that. When we look around the world, we look at the chaos that large organizations are facing, one of their challenges is to make sense of this incredible diversity. And the Mindset Index boldly aims to index the mind. It really is an ambitious project. But it is an enormously powerful tool for those with diverging stakeholders, which families are, of course, a part of, in the sense that it helps you to read the divergent mindsets and therefore helps you to make better decisions.
Absolutely. And Morne, the word survival for me was key. It's a thing that I think people often misquote, but they say Darwin said it's survival of the fittest. Darwin never said survival of the fittest. Darwin said survival of those who can adapt.
Right.
So following that same line of thinking, see the family in its fragility. See the family, typically statistically, in its inability to function together as a unit. And think about all the challenges. We can be very practical and just refer to regulatory change as a challenge, but let's bring it closer to home. If the family is typically unable to decide together in the interest of the family, you mentioned globalization. We could have a very interesting conversation about local scale versus global scale cooperation. The reality is, if we do not have goal alignment, and if we will never share, we as a family, share the same mindset, but if we can understand how we perceive the need to work together, we just might not sweat the small stuff.
Your language is really on point. I particularly like the phrase of deciding together. And, when people hear the word fragility, they often think, well, I'm not fragile. I'm robust. I'm resilient. I can bounce back. I can take it. I've been through the mill. The reality, though, is that families is not one person. So families are systems, as you said. There are other parts involved in various generations, and some from the inside and some from the outside of the family, and so on. And that is what opens the door to a little bit of that fragility. But then this important family competence of deciding together.
Absolutely.
Now, in fact, we have a word for that called consensus, meaning sensing together or deciding together. But to reach that consensus, that kind of mind togetherness, we currently judge on behavior. So we look at behavior and we say, well, what's the extent of our mind togetherness, our consensus, our deciding together? There's a much, much better way of doing that. Rather than trying to figure out the mind through the behavior, why not figure out the mind through the mind?
Exactly.
Just go direct to the mind. Now, we've skirted around this issue for a long time, and the mind, to be honest, is not a very simple thing. It can be very complex. But I think we're making an important contribution to the study of the mind and really pioneering the study, the identification of paradigms as the basis for decision-making so that families can start to get the behavior and results they're looking for in the long term.
Morne, absolutely. And without that, I almost want to say the direct means of mindset interrogation, seeking to understand, it would be very difficult to affect behavioral change. We, of course, believe that or understand that the first step to behavioral change is acceptance. But if we accept that the family is not functioning optimally, if we accept that family inactivity, for example, is a real problem, we must also be inspired by the fact that the mind is not set.
Yes.
This can change. We have the ability to respond differently to the challenges within family, but it starts with, I almost want to say, that aha moment. Which is possible through this instrument.
That's right. And I'm linking this back to your earlier observation about agency.
Yes.
And your comments on Stoicism, this idea that it's not about what happens to you, but how you respond to that. People often misinterpret Stoicism as if it is some sort of fatalism, that you just accept whatever happens. Quite the contrary. Some of the sort of founders of Stoicism, Epictetus, a slave, and Marcus Aurelius, a ruler, the most powerful man in the world, embraced this philosophy. And the idea of agency is a surprising part, including of Stoicism. It is this idea that we can, using your earlier language, decide together. To know how well we decide together, why don't we investigate our minds together? May sound a little null for some people, but those decisions come from somewhere. I'm sure as a family member, you've looked at other family members, looked at their decisions and thought, where does this come from? Well, now we have an instrument that can help you to answer that.
Absolutely. And I have to come back to this idea of not sweating the small stuff. If you think about acting pro-family, which is really what this is all about, if you think about decision-making that will enable pro-family behavior, it has to start with this difficult and effortful process of understanding ourselves, understanding us, but all of this in the interest of cooperation.
Yes, so if cooperation and pro-family behavior is an example of the behavior, then you have to say, well, so what kind of decision-making gives you pro-family behavior? And you have to say, well, that's pro-family decision-making. And then we're asking, well, what gives you the pro-family decision-making? And that's a pro-family mindset.
Absolutely.
So if you don't know whether you have a pro-family mindset or not, then you have to base the decisions, just as we say, flying blind, based on almost nothing.
Morne, and again, we're back at the family as a collective and their ability to anticipate things. Let's make it clear today that we understand the relevance of this. We understand the need to extend this conversation, as we have done over 3 episodes. But we also need to just clarify why it is so important. And the big thing for me to bring it back to numbers, suppose you're talking to a finance guy, that was going to happen, is family enterprises account for 70% of global GDP.
Incredible.
So this is not the stakes have never been higher, to quote you from our previous episode. The strategies which do not recognize family dynamics almost continue to serve as a bad flight plan. And continue to, on the back of investment performance, meeting expectations, providing this validation that the family is growing and moving forward optimally. I think we can do more. I think we've aligned on the point that we can do more, but it's really the case of understanding that family governance has a fit in wealth management practice, but the mindset to support that fit is something that we need to work equally hard at developing.
I think that's right, and that family strategy is a really interesting idea. And And one of the ways to think about this is to think about a sort of hierarchy of thinking. And so when we help large organizations with this, just very quickly and simply, we say to people, you can think at a level of task, sort of to-do list every day. You could say a series of tasks gives you an activity. A series of activities gives you a process if you organize them and you structure them. Very often rules, such as traditional governance structures, stop at that level.
Right.
They give you the operations, the so-called rule book.
Yes.
The rule book isn't always the playbook, because play is much more fluid than that. The rule book is not yet the playbook. To translate the rule book into a playbook, you need to go beyond task, activity, and process to tactics. Now, tactics gives you an internal orientation. So you can say, okay, so inside this family, you know, we always behave like this. We're now going to try and behave a bit more like that and a bit less like this. Beyond the tactics, if you want to play in the global space, you need to link the internal world with the external world.
Yep.
And that is the world of strategic thinking.
Yes.
Beyond tactics to strategy. And then to your world of anticipation, which is the future. So the sort of hierarchy works: task, activity, process, rule book. Now the playbook: tactics, internal; strategy, external; future, anticipation.
Morne, I love the way that you broke that down. For someone who places a great value on reasoning from first principles, I love how you took that apart. I almost want to challenge you on that or meet you on that, and just swap out the word rule book for family constitution.
Right.
Because effectively, this is what happens in our industry.
Right.
A family would approach a wealth management practice or a family office with the hope of saying, provide us with this rule-based system effectively to assist, regulate, and to assist us to regulate and preserve our wealth. But we are a social system. Okay, of course, no client says this, but I'm trying to make a point. So what you're saying is that you cannot apply rules in this context. This is what you validated again. And hope that we now have a rule book that will facilitate everything. Something that we absolutely believe at SFO is that without family culture, let me rather put it this way, that family culture really is the operating system of the family. If the culture is conducive to collaboration, if the culture is conducive to good communication, then something like a rule book or family constitution is of value. Otherwise, it's something that goes and lives in a drawer somewhere.
It's the sad reality. We certainly see in the world of innovation that you cannot rule yourself into innovation and creativity. It's impossible. And in fact, when you look at social systems, of which the family is an example, and governments are other examples.
Exactly.
In fact, the more rule-bound the dictator, the lower the country on the innovation index. So they're not only not compatible, but they're counterproductive in certain cases. But if you treat them in a complementary way, then you have the possibility to transcend the rules. It doesn't mean ignoring the rules. And I want to just make this distinction clear. It's not about ignoring the rules. We often think about rules for innovation, for example, in agile systems, which we can talk about a little bit. Perhaps just worth saying a word or two about agility. We often think of agility, if I may extend the car metaphor.
Please.
Agility is not about going quickly. It's about the ability to adjust your speed.
That's very interesting.
So you can think of it like the accelerator in your car. Agility is not high speed. Agility is the discernment, to use your earlier word, judgment, to use that accelerator as and when you need it. Now, the importance of that cannot be underestimated for families, because that ability to have both the rules, which give you a kind of structure, broad architecture, and the agility as a family to make decisions, which come from the mindset, that really positions you perfectly. Now, those decisions have an origin, and yes, you're right, that does have something to do with the culture. So when we work with high innovation organizations, we sometimes contrast these two models. We say, which one are you? And we can think about it in terms of your family.
Right.
Are you family model A that works like this? Nothing is allowed except this. Or are you family model B? Everything is allowed except that. And that's just a very, very basic example of just how different mindsets could be in families. Now, if you have, two key decision makers in different generations, one with a family A model and one with a family B model, that behavior is going to be highly fragmented.
Absolutely. So what we must allow for, and I don't want to say allow for, what we must absolutely design for is the kind of space that a family holds for diversity. But coming back to exactly how you frame this now, there's almost these transcendent qualities of culture which should and could be preserved. And this could be ideas like, as part of our culture, we are compliant. As part of our culture, we are supportive. So I almost want to say, just going back to Stoic philosophy, for me, the major intrigue of Stoic philosophy, except everything about it, is the fact that it is based on 4 cardinal virtues, which almost become, I see them more as handrails rather than rule-based, if that makes sense. So again, coming back to the idea of family, what is the purpose of this thing? It's so that it can be conducive to us flourishing together. All of this for the family to flourish. And that could and should mean that as the family branches out, different cultures are incorporated. It is only conducive to that. But the things that mattered in the first generation are still applicable and carried over going forward.
I think it's really important to have that kind of appreciative approach. Because when we investigate the future of social systems, even though it's about the future, we do occasionally also look at the past. Of course, we pay attention to the present also. And in that past, we do a process called redeeming the past. It's about an appreciative inquiry of the past to consider what that might mean for the longer-term future.
Right.
And in that consideration of the past, we have a little heuristic, a little sort of rule of thumb acronym called OPACH. OPACH. It's a little acronym. It just very briefly, the O is for origins. Where did this thing come from? Right. Where was it born? And the reason that's so important is that those things tend to perpetuate themselves into the future. So I work all over the world with, I don't know, from anywhere, from Paris or Riyadh in Saudi Arabia. And even though these are people who have traveled the world and seen everything and done everything, where they come from still matters.
Yes.
The origins are still there. Now, they're celebrated and expressed in different ways, but they still matter. Very briefly, the rest of the OPACH, the P is for patterns. What happens again and again and again in this family? We can now see that in the mind. Patterns of the mind, not just patterns in the behavior. And that means we can anticipate behavior. The A is for attitudes. That's the emotional stuff. That's the emotional stuff. Very difficult to see in spreadsheets. Very difficult to see in constitutions. And perhaps the single most impactful factor on decision making. Origins, patterns, attitudes. The T is for traditions. How do we celebrate? What are our rituals? What do we think is fairness in this culture? What's balance in this culture? What's temperance, to use a Stoic word? The C is for culture itself. What are the dominant behaviors here? And the H is for habits. Origins, patterns, attitudes, traditions, cultures, and habits. Habits are particularly interesting because habits are those things we do in the absence of thinking. And so because I work in the world of thinking, of futures thinking, systems thinking, strategic thinking, and so on, I often ask people, well, if you accept the thesis that a habit is something that you do without thinking, then what is a thinking habit? And the way we try to explain that is that a thinking habit is when you think that you're thinking.
Right.
But when you think about it,
I see what you did there.
You're not really thinking at all. In other words, and now I'm bringing it back to mindset, you're exhibiting thinking patterns that have essentially become outdated.
So, Morne, do you think that we could almost explain that as sort of the illusion of progress? So
Absolutely.
I think just sort of dialectically, I am thinking.
Yeah.
So I am thinking effectively.
Yeah, that's right. When in reality, of course, not all thinking's good.
So there is that.
There is that. Some thinking's really, really bad. And then not all thinking is really thinking. They're really patterns that are simply being repeated. But to develop that consciousness of the thinking patterns helps you to make much more conscious decisions. Most decisions are made subconsciously. And that doesn't mean they're wrong. There's some interesting work on gut and so on. But if you can be conscious, then at least you can think about your thinking. You can think about whether that thinking is appropriate. And then you can decide whether the behavior that is the result of that thinking and decision-making is worth it or whether you'd like to change it.
Morne, if we look at also, just coming back to this idea of communication, and we look at the conversations that are typically occupying meeting agendas right now in the context of family. But conversations, as you know, are so focused externally. And what I mean by externally is largely with financial services professionals, the conversation tends to focus on performance, assets, at least. Would you believe me if I tell you from a generation 2 or 3 perspective that more attention is given to topics like AI right now than, I almost want to say, necessary qualitative interventions from a family governance perspective? I'm not against technology. I embrace it. But I almost want to say, as ek kan, dis die verskil tussen AI en I. And really what this becomes is, and I think why this conversation is so important is to keep driving the awareness of need, to understand that family governance, mindset, behavioral change, these are not fuzzy, qualitative topics. These are matters of extreme consequence. Matters that need to be prioritized, probably equally, if not more so, given the catch-up that's required or the work that is required in relation to investment-driven discussions.
Discussions as a means of communication is, again, I would say, a behavior. So even if you say, we in this family need to talk more. That's a fantastic call. Let's have more discussions. But when we have those discussions, our mindsets have already developed. We often enter those discussions with prefabricated decisions. So we often think of those decisions as a way of sense-making, when in reality, they're little more than sense-taking. There's a dominant figure who expects everyone to take the sense that they might suggest. There is an alternative to that very artificial way of solving problems. And I think the important thing here is, don't take our word for it.
Yeah.
Look at what's going on in reality.
Exactly.
As Dr. Phil would say, how's that working out for you? Look at the reality on the ground. Look at the quality of the decisions that you observe in the family. Look at the kind of the extent of the alignment in the behavior between various generations, and then decide. Then decide, is this sustainable? Is this built for the long term? Or is there another way in which we can think about it to make this even more sustainable? Now, in that diagnostic process, you have to be a little bit careful, because let's apply it again to the sort of car situation. In the old days, people had petrol in their cars. And for the young people, I'm not making this up. It actually did happen. Now, you can't decide on the sustainability of the fuel tank. In other words, how much further can this go, based on whether the car's driving now or not. You can't say, well, I don't need fuel. Look, the car's driving. What's the problem?
Exactly.
And that's where futures thinking starts to enter the picture a little bit for your sustainability issue, the legacy of the family. Because the fact that it's driving now doesn't say anything about what will happen in 30 seconds.
Absolutely. And I think, as you were speaking, what I could think of, it works until it doesn't.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
But really where we've entered into now, if we again just zoom out all the way, is we are in the latent need space. We are in the anticipatory thinking space.
Yeah.
And again, let's make this very real. Things happen which we do not expect, which we do not design for. Think about COVID. Think about the forced decision-making which happened in that period. Let's not talk about COVID. Let's talk about what happened pre and post the implementation of the Common Reporting Standard and the era of transparency that we now find ourselves in. If families are not agile in their ability to work together, how can this highly complex, multifaceted social system now suddenly organize to make decisions about effectively their financial future? Again, coming back to Stoicism, is this idea that Stoic philosophy, just as something that we both naturally reference, is inherently a practical philosophy. It's something it's doable. And what's really important about what we're busy with our research is it's not just interesting research. It's got real, practical, doable value.
That's exactly right. And in fact, even the Stoics would say you can control two things, not just your actions. But even then, we're talking about just over 2,000 years ago, they said not just your actions, your thoughts and your actions.
Absolutely.
And the reason that they made that distinction is because even they realized your actions come from somewhere.
Absolutely.
So if you can control your thinking, and by control we don't mean suppress, we mean fly the plane, control the plane in that way, or drive the Formula One car, control in that respect. If you can drive that car of your mind, well, then you will see the behavior. So they, even at that very early stage, thought about the idea that your thoughts matter because they create your actions. And so again, if you apply your agency to this, if you can decide what you're thinking, I mean, you can think about it like this. Who in your family has in their Outlook diary, at least once a week, something that says, let's say on a Thursday afternoon, 2 to 4, thinking? Now, you can just imagine the old patriarch phoning in and saying, what are you guys doing down there? Well, we're thinking. What are you thinking about? Well, we're thinking about thinking. Glad you guys are working down there. Keep it up. But let's imagine you don't have it. Where do you think the behavior comes from?
Absolutely.
The behavior comes from patterns.
Exactly.
And if you accept things change all the time, which we tell each other around the braai every day, if you accept things change all the time, well, to what extent is your thinking being updated? And that is why when we get into those behaviors of the family meetings and the family discussions and the family debates, the thinking hasn't been updated. But we only find it out then.
Exactly.
Wouldn't it be useful, as the Stoics also said, to anticipate the problem?
Absolutely.
Anticipate the problem. And, something like the Mindset Index helps you to anticipate that by telling you about the mindset. I should just add very quickly that the index is not designed to be in any way judgmental. It's simply a reading,
of course,
of different perspectives, different mindsets. And the idea is to weave that together into something that creates cohesion in the family rather than disruption.
Morne, thank you for clarifying that point, because it's very important that we clarify and confirm its compatibility with the wealth management first principles framework. And this very point forms the basis for that compatibility. What we are doing effectively is we are allowing a means to contextualize decision-making. Not all decision-making is bad. The question is just, is the decision-making mostly pro-family? And that is why the Mindset Index is a complementary instrument for the wealth management first principles framework, and why there is a natural basis for us to collaborate as we have. I am hugely excited about the work, but not because it's new and interesting. I'm excited about this because it's new and it's necessary. If what we really are talking about here, if we zoom out all the way, is this idea of yours, or this observation of yours, that the family is almost flying blind. I keep coming back to what we at SFO use as a central metaphor, which is the murmurations. You and I have discussed this many times. But it, for me, is such a honest representation of family for a couple of reasons. But firstly, because these are not birds flying in a V. It's not some perfect shape. Family is way more organic than that. But the other thing that the central metaphor recognizes in the context of continuity is that succession or continuity is not a handover. We stop and here's the handover. That's not how it works. It's in motion.
Yes.
Something we refer to often in session, and in sessions with families at least, is this idea of almost reframing succession as a relay race. The family, the entrepreneurial family, has a life cycle. Objectives change. A family, well, if we just create an archetype quickly, if you just think about a patriarch, serious entrepreneur, has spent the majority of their life being an entrepreneur. So the objectives and the frame of reference, the mindset really has been that of being a wealth creator. The toolkit, the mindset, the decision-making, the behavior, the everything, the identity, the very identity, everything that underpins that. To become a successful entrepreneur speaks to having wealth creation objectives. This, as a toolkit, cannot be imposed on wealth preservation. And it's very interesting, sort of at this stage of development of the body of work, to understand how this could truly support the mindset shift. So this isn't about reprogramming or creating a new mindset. This is about understanding that objectives can change as we change. And simply, I almost want to say, facilitating and supporting the shift from being a wealth creator to entering the preservation space.
I think that's such an interesting observation, because all shifts need support. And the greater the shift, the greater the need for support. I'll give you a silly example. I've done a lot of consulting work for the mines, and in the very good mines where safety is important, every time there is the slightest change in a tool, an instrument, a piece of technology, a methodology, the senior people in the good mines take it so seriously that they have what they call daily change announcements on a shift basis. They get everybody together and they guide them through the change that they'll experience on this shift. It's also interesting that they use the word shift like that, because of course the idea that every shift will shift things,
Right.
move things forward. And so this language is interesting because we talk about this great wealth transfer, and that is, of course, an enormous shift.
Mm.
With that comes a paradigm shift.
Morne, and this brings us back to really having answered the why for family mindset. I must tell you, I really enjoyed these 3 episodes with you. I'm excited to do this now because I've been waiting 2.5 episodes to do this. But I think we can announce now formally that you will be joining SFO Research as a collaborator,
Yes.
looking specifically at family mindset and working very closely with us on the continued development of pro-family behavior. I say again, firstly, this is not a new interesting behavioral science project that we're busy with. In the context of what we've discussed here today, we've really just highlighted or daylighted. Can we say daylight? It's the evening show. Probably
It
not.
should be a word.
We've moonlighted. We've illuminated the need for pro-family behavior as necessary work. Family governance is key, or let me rather say, family governance is essential to support wealth preservation. And the continued work in seeking to understand and advance the understanding of pro-family behavior will simply make it more achievable. As you said, the stakes have never been higher. We are talking about the most complex context, family. And there is a global relevance to systemic change in terms of cooperation.
It is absolutely critical in the global financial system. And in fact, the greatest wealth transfer in history will also be the greatest family transfer in history. The science is essential.
Absolutely. And what I almost want to split or discern is that when we talk about the greatest wealth transfer, it cannot only be in a financial or from a financial perspective. What we also need to recognize is the underlying value, which I like to see as the transferable wealth of knowledge, which exists within each family and is something that we need to work very hard at preserving and continuing in support of a true multi-generational successful story.
That's a very inspiring idea.
So Morne, thank you very much for joining, and I'm finally glad that I could make the announcement. I've been looking forward to that.
Yes.
I look forward to continuing the conversation with you and to the related work that we'll be putting out. And yeah, thank you very much for joining me this evening.
Always a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, Morne. Financial markets close at 5 p.m. Night markets open at 6. Thank you very much for joining this evening for part 3 of the Family Mindset episode with myself and my colleague Dr. Morne Mostert. Over the past 3 episodes, we've discussed the greatest wealth transfer and its challenges in detail, and how pro-family behavior is a key focus area for SFO Research. Effectively, a paradigm shift is taking place, and frameworks and tools could certainly be helpful. Thank you for joining us.